Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, my hunters. I am Marcia from Mom Hunts Dead People, and we are here at episode 5 of the witness statements from the Lizzie Borden murder trial, where I read through the primary source document of the witness statements, word for word, except for some ad-libbing here and there because the spelling and the grammar is atrocious. And leave my wonderfully insightful commentary. So let's get this started. Albert E. Chase, Fall River, Massachusetts, August 5th, 1892. The following articles and wearing apparel were this afternoon taken from a wash tub in the cellar washroom of the Borden house by orders of the city marshal and medical examiner, and were buried under my direction in the yard back of the barn. 1 sofa pillow and tidy, 1 large piece of Brussels carpet, 1 roll of cotton batting, 1 sheet and several pieces of cotton cloth, 3 towels, 1 napkin, 1 chemise, 1 dress, 1 pair of drawers, 1 skirt, 2 aprons, 1 hair braid, and several pieces of hair from Mrs. Borden's head, from 5 to 8 inches long, 1 necktie, 1 truss, 1 piece of black silk braid or watch guard. I also found mixed in with the hair of Mrs. Borden a piece of bone, which from it nature I took to be a piece of Mrs. Borden's skull. It was cut so smooth that I thought it might be of use in determining what kind of instrument was used, as the bone and hair both had the appearance of being cut with a very sharp instrument. I gave this piece of bone to Dr. Dolan. About the middle of the next week, Dr. Dolan ordered all the articles dug up. After taking out pieces of clothing and of the carpet, they were ordered buried again. This time, they were put in a box. What in the flying hell? Is this standard operating procedure for police? Definitely not nowadays. We have evidence rooms. And sometimes evidence sits in there for decades. But as of August 5th, they do not have a killer. But they have determined that everything here is, I guess, no longer needed as evidence. So they buried it. And it says they were buried in the yard back of the barn. Is this like the police station yard? Is this the yard of the Borden house? Did you bury the evidence behind the barn of the Borden house? I'm hoping not, because no wonder people claim that it's haunted. And if you buried it behind the police station, why couldn't you have burned it? But then again, if they had burned it, they would have lost all the evidence, because then Dr. Dolan comes back and he's like, hey, pull that all up. I need to get that one and that one. Yeah, I think we're good. Give me that one too. Yeah, put the rest in a box and rebury it. So it was buried just in a hole in the ground, because it wasn't until Dr. Dolan came back to get his pieces of clothing and the piece of carpet that they bothered to put it in a box. So they just dug a hole and just tossed all the evidence and buried it. And they're like, hey guys, let's remember that it's there, right? Let's remember that we put this evidence there. No one's ever going to find it if we don't want them to. But it sounds like more like a criminal doing something instead of the police doing something. Oh, my holy moly. Okay, maybe that was standard police procedure back in the day. Thank you, police, for evolving. We greatly appreciate it, especially everybody who was falsely convicted and needed that evidence to prove that they were falsely convicted. We greatly appreciate your more modern methods of preserving evidence in a climate-controlled environment and not throw it into a hole in the ground. Fall River, August 17th, 1892. During the past 13 days, I have been on duty at the Borden house at the front door. During all this time, the front door locked every time it was closed. No one has been ever admitted without first ringing the bell. Several times the people who were inside have stepped out to speak to me, and the door would close and lock them out, and they would have to ring to get in. I have tried the door a great many times, and always found it locked. Have seen a great many other people try to get in before ringing the bell, but the door was always locked. I have never seen anyone get in without being let in by someone from the inside. I will tell you from experience, a self-locking door can be very annoying. In Germany, this was very much the norm, and I have locked myself out because I was standing in the doorway of my apartment talking to a neighbor. I stepped just a little bit too far, the door clicked behind me, and I had to call the locksmith because I could not get back in. I was planning to leave my apartment, so I didn't have my keys with me. I mean, it's nice from a security standpoint, but oh my God, make sure you have your keys if you have a self-locking door. And as for him checking the door several times, the dude was bored. His job was to stand there at the front door, probably was to take note, whether actually write down or at least take a mental note of who came and went. But the dude was bored. Of course, he tried the door. Fall River, August 19th, 1892. Investigation made of the character of Charles B. Peckham, who came to the city yesterday and gave himself up, saying he killed A.J. Borden. I found Mr. Peckham lived on a farm in South Westport, about 8.5 miles from the city, on what is called the Sodom Road. From inquiries among the neighbors, I found that he had been insane for years, but that he was considered perfectly harmless. His wife told me that he had been crazy by spells for the last 18 years and had been away once before about 6 years ago. She said that he was taken sick July 13th last past and had been confined to the house most of the time since. On the 4th of August, he was at home all day and lay on the lounge most of the time. Also, that he had never been to the city on Thursday except yesterday, since they had lived on the farm. He had read of the Borden murders in the New Bedford Standard, and ever since that, he kept saying he was going to Fall River to give himself up, as he was the man who had killed them. When he left home, he told his wife he was going to give himself up, and she thought no more of it, expecting he would only go to one of the neighbors and be home to dinner. I found him to be well known as a crank for several miles about there. I kind of feel sorry for this man. It looks like he's got something going on. But yeah, it looks like they vetted him, and the police are like, he's harmless, he's crazy, it's a false confession. People are known for a variety of reasons to give false confessions. This is particularly troublesome when there is a serial killer running about. Luckily, this was not such a case. And sometimes, once you give a false confession, the police may be under a lot of pressure just to find the murderer. And they're like, yeah, cool, you confessed, you're it. Luckily, in this case, they're like, yeah, something's not quite right. Let's investigate. We don't see any link to this guy. We've never heard of this guy. And turns out, yeah, no. Even when Charles Peckham said to his wife, hey, I'm going to go turn myself in, she's probably like, okay, cool. He's going to go to the neighbor's house, think it's the police station, and probably confess at the neighbor's house that he murdered these people. My neighbors are going to humor my husband, and then he'll wander home for dinner. But he did manage to make it to town and the police station. Fall River, August 24th, 1892. Investigation in regard to time, Jonathan Clegg, Gents Furnisher, number 6 North Main Street, states that A.J. Borden was in his store Thursday, August 4th, talking with him in regard to his leasing his store on South Main Street. He left his store at just 10:29 to go to the South Main Street store. Mr. Borden was seen standing in the door of said store by the men at work inside, also by Edmund Whitehead, who saw him leave the store and turn up Spring Street, but cannot fix the time. Mrs. Lizzie Gray, corner of Spring and 2nd Street, saw Mr. Borden as he came up Spring Street and turned north on 2nd Street towards home. She cannot fix the exact time, but says it was between 10 and 11 o'clock, and but a short time before the murder. Dr. Kelly's wife, who lives next south of Mr. Borden, saw him going into his house, thinks it was 10:35 or a little later. L. Hall, 83 2nd Street, says that Mrs. Churchill came to his stable after a man that works for her to go after a doctor for Mr. Borden, who had been badly hurt. Mr. Hall says it was then 10:30. He was positive of this, for he looked at his watch. John J. Cunningham, who carries papers, was going to Mr. Hall's stable and says Mrs. Churchill and several men were talking very serious. He asked them what the matter was, and a boy by the name of Albert Pierce told him that someone had stabbed A.J. Borden at his house. Cunningham says he went right to Mr. Gorman's store, corner of 2nd and Borden Streets, and telephoned what he had heard, first to the city marshal, then to the Daily Globe office. By the clock in Mr. Gorman's store, it was then 10 minutes to 11, but it may not have been right. As I said, news got around of this. For one thing, they were saying he was stabbed instead of having his face smashed in with a hatchet. If you remember back to episode 1, the police officer was like he was cut with a razor or something, deep, thin cuts, sharp. And I was like, okay, that is a weird analogy, saying that he was cut with a razor when he had his face hacked up with a hatchet. But sure. But now they have Mrs. Churchill. Are we surprised as Mrs. Churchill? We are not. We are not surprised Mrs. Churchill is all up in this. But she's gossiping with several men. And then John Cunningham comes by and is like, hey, what are you guys talking about? Like, you're all really serious. Like, he was stabbed. So we've gone from faces cut with something like a razor to he was stabbed. And when I think of a stabbing, I'm thinking soft body parts. I rarely think of stabbing to the face. But normally people tend to stab, abdomen. And the first thing John Cunningham does is, luckily, the very, very first thing he does is he runs to the marshal and he's like, there's been a stabbing. The second thing he does is contact the local news. That is awesome. He's like, you're not going to believe this. It's like, I got news on a murder. Or he may not have even realized it was a murder because he just says that he was been stabbed. So he may have just been like, hey, I got news on a stabbing of a prominent figure in town. How much that story worth? I know, I'd be asking for money on that one. James Leonard, who drives for Dr. Bowen, says B had drove up to the house with the doctor when his wife came out and told the doctor to go right over to Borden's, as something terrible had happened. It was then 5 minutes past 11. Alice M. Russell says that Bridget Sullivan came to her house, 33 Borden Street, at 11:15 and told her Mr. Borden had been badly hurt, and Lizzie, who wanted her to come up there right away. Charles Sawyer says that he went up 2nd Street with Miss Russell and that she went into the Borden house. And as he turned to go away, he met Officer G.W. Allen and went into the house with the officer. Alexander B. Cogshall, a stable keeper on 2nd Street, left his stable at 11:10 to go to dinner. He stopped to talk with Mrs. Buffington, and she told him that there had been trouble in the next house. Just then Bridget Sullivan came out of the house on the run and went over to Southard H. Miller's house and went in. Soon after, Mr. Miller came to the door and called him over and said, "Here, Alex, I want you to listen to what this girl says." Bridget then told them that Mr. Borden and his wife had both been murdered. Mr. Cogshall then went to dinner at Mrs. Tripp's, number 82nd Street, and he told her of the murder. It was then 11:20 by the clock in the restaurant. Fall River, September 20, 1892. I this day visited the Borden house under instructions from the city marshal. I saw Miss Emma Borden, and she went down cellar with me and showed me a window in the northeast corner, room nearest to the barn, and the next north of the cellar door, which she wanted to have fastened up, and told me to note the condition that it was in before anything was done. I found one light of glass broken in the upper sash. The lower sash bad the appearance of being pushed in and raised up about 5 inches. A. Perrin, August 18th, 1892. 8:30 o'clock, P.M. Joseph LeMay of North Steep Brook reports that about 5:30 o'clock this afternoon, while in the woods about a mile from his house, he heard somebody say, "Too bad about Mrs. Borden." Looking around to his left, he saw a man sitting down on a stone. Mr. LeMay asked him if he was tired. The man made no reply, but took up a small hatchet and commenced to grind his teeth. Mr. LeMay says that he had some spots of blood on what was once a white shirt, 3 drops. His coat sleeves were pulled up so that his wristbands of the shirt could be seen, and there was some blood on both of them. They looked at each other for some minutes, when the man got up, jumped a wall, and went in the northerly direction. Description: 30 or 35 years of age, height about 5 feet 3 inches, 140 pounds weight, brown mustache, quite good size, face looked as though be bad not been shaven in 2 or 3 weeks, dressed in black coat, dark pants, laced shoes, black derby hat, torn on top, looked as though he had been having hard times recently, as he was a hard-looking customer. Investigated by A. Perrin, August 17th, 1892, and finds it is as reported as above. I am not surprised that he had drops of blood on him because, am I reading this right? It's because I don't have my glasses on and the font isn't big enough. But he took up a small hatchet and commenced to grind his teeth. I take that to mean with the hatchet? Like you're grinding your teeth with a hatchet? And do they mean like grinding as in like filing down? Or did they mean grinding as in like picking, like maybe flossing with a hatchet? Either way, not something I would recommend. P.T. Barker, August 4th, 1892. Statement of Mrs. Mary A. Chase, who lives over Wade's store, 2nd Street, about 10:45 o'clock today, saw a man sitting on Mr. Borden's fence in backyard, picking pears and filling his pockets. When B saw her, he jumped down between the fence and the barn in the rear, was dressed in dark clothes, a dark hat. Statement of George H. Kelly. About 6 o'clock tonight, while at Stone Bridge, saw a man whom he took to be a Portuguese cross the bridge and stop at Draw Tender's shed. He said to Mr. Kelly and Draw Tender that he wanted to find a way to New York. They noticed the way he talked, and it was so queer that Draw Tender said, "What in the hell do you want anyway?" The Portuguese said he wanted to find the way to New York. The draw tender told him he would have to walk to Newport. Edwin D McKenry. Fall River, 28, 1892. The following is the result of my interview last Saturday night with Mrs. Whitehead. I could not reach her mother, Mrs. Oliver Gray, the stepmother of the late Mrs. Abby Borden, until today. I found her at the home of Mr. Benjamin Covell at the top of 2nd Street. I questioned her at length as to whether there was anything new that had come to her mind since she was last seen. She stated that Officer Harrington had been to see her, but since that time she had heard a great deal. She also stated that Mr. and Mrs. Chase had gone to Tiverton, Rhode Island, and Little Compton, to remain away until after this Borden case had been disposed of, and that Mrs. Chase was the woman above all others that was needed to let light in on Lizzie's actions. Mrs. Gray had heard the scandal story as coming from Mrs. Chase direct. She also stated that for years, whenever she or any of Mrs. Borden's relatives visited the house on 2nd Street, they were totally ignored by the girls, Lizzie and Emma. I then read your anonymous letter to her. She said that was true, every word of it, although she could not imagine who the writer was, and that her sister, Mrs. Borden, Mrs. Fish in Hartford, was the one, and her daughter-in-law, that was referred to. I then pressed the old lady very hard as to what was said, as coming from Mrs. Churchill. She demurred, finally admitting she got her information from Mrs. Potter and her sister, Miss Dimon, the milliners on 4th Street. I then looked up the above-mentioned ladies and found them very hard people to handle. I was with them both 2 hours and elicited the following. Lizzie Borden had been practicing in a gymnasium for a long time, and she had boasted of the strength she possessed, not to these people, but to others. The place where she practiced was supposed to be in the Troy block. I also elicited the fact that one George Wiley, a clerk at the Troy Mill, is the one who is authority for the statement that Mrs. Churchill made, that she, Mrs. Churchill, said that there was one thing she saw in the house the day of the murder that she would never repeat, even if they tore her tongue out. And that is it, folks. We have done it. We have finished the witness statements. Yay! We have a bunch of other files to go through. Don't think this is over. We have Lizzie's interrogation. We have the court records. We've got a ton left to do. But we finished the witness statements, which felt like that was going to go on forever. So congratulations, everybody. We did it. All right, everyone, I'm going to start prepping for the next set of documents. And until then, happy hunting.